welcome. I am really excited and pleased to share this interview with you with Dr. John Britton, an accomplished anesthesiologist. It's hard to say anesthesiologist without
It
sounding
is.
like
It's a
you're
hard
drunk,
word, and
I
let's
have
just
to
say
say.
that.
But John, at the very top of his professional game, experienced something very profound that created a tremendous health crisis that affected the right side of his brain. And he went through quite a period of loss, and not only having to step back from his practice, losing his driver's license, having to dedicate his life full time to his recovery. I'm truly honored to know John and to have had time with him. And his exploration has opened up this fascinating exploration about the functioning of the brain. You may know some about left brain, right brain functioning. John's currently writing about his experiences, about his recovery, and about the practices that have helped him to recover. And I feel that for someone who is interested in becoming more whole, more awake, more enlightened, if you will, his story and his insights are truly compelling. So, John, thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Well, Jonathan, I'm so glad to be here. It's great.
So, I always find it interesting to think in terms of it's sort of like the call to action, if you will, like the hero's journey. Something happens, and then we have to respond to the call. And I wonder if you could just share with us some of the backstory about what happened that turned your life upside down and had you reorient your life.
Yeah, I will admit it's kind of an interesting story, but when I was a resident in anesthesiology, I got a little herpetic infection in my finger. Back when I was a resident, we didn't use gloves. It wasn't considered necessary, and no protective eyewear. And I put a breathing tube in a young boy that had been badly burned, and he'd had no signs that he had um, cold sores on his lips, but he probably harbored the herpes virus, which is herpes simplex type 1. There's two types of herpes virus, one that's around your face and one that's around your genital area. But anyway, the infection traveled up my arm, and I had severe pain in my arm for a few days, and it went away with antiviral treatment. And then 30 years later, it came back. And what I found, I've learned so much about basically herpes viruses and neurology, but it basically lives at the base of your brain in this nerve called the fifth cranial nerve, which is the nerve that provides sensation to your face and to your brain, actually. And then 30 years later, it came back and it affected my brain.
So for 30 years, it basically resided there dormant, if you will.
Mhm.
Any sense of what sort of triggered the event?
No, people talk about some sort of stress that causes the virus to come out, but I can't say as I had any any outstanding stress. I was just working really hard, taking call. I can't think of anything in particular, but yeah, what happened was I fainted in the doctor's lounge while I was having breakfast, and um, I was completely passed out. I woke up and went to the emergency room. I was perfectly lucid. And they couldn't find anything to hang their hat on, so I was discharged.
Wow. So you were discharged, you left, and you just assumed that was kind of an anomaly of some kind.
Yeah, I felt a little tired, but not. I didn't really think about it very much. I think sometimes you deny things because when you're working hard and you're going through the education process, you just sort of ignore a lot of feelings. which maybe we can come back to. But anyway, yeah, I didn't think much of it. So, and then the following day, I was supposed to go see my mom in Vermont, who had a bunch of doctor's appointments. She was suffering from cancer, and I was going to visit the oncologist. So I went up to see her in Vermont. Flew up and had a rental car, and then I started feeling very drowsy, like really drowsy, and I couldn't figure out why. So I stopped. I stopped my rental car in front of a little strip mall in a small town in New Hampshire. And there was a police officer that pulled up next to me, and he had me roll down my window, and he said, I've been getting reports that you've been driving erratically. I need to have you come with me. So I came, and I had a breathalyzer test, which was negative. And so then he called a narcotics officer, who is a district narcotics officer, who said, I know you're on drugs. I said, no, I'm an anesthesiologist. I know what drugs are. I'm not on any sort of drugs. And they said, well, we're going to take you to a hospital and get your blood drawn. So they took me to this hospital. It was getting kind of dark. And it was negative. Everything was negative.
So they took you to the hospital to draw your blood to basically prove that you were on some form of narcotics or something.
That's right. And the test was completely negative.
So what was your experience like there? I mean, suddenly here you are, this upstanding guy who's being accused of being on narcotics. And what was that like?
That's an interesting question, because there's so much denial and burying of feelings. I think normally people would be very angry or scared. I wasn't either one. I just sort of, wow, this is very interesting. I'm going to have to go through this process, and hopefully things will turn out all right so I can get to Vermont. Mm-hmm. And there was a hooker. The cop said, well, I'm going to confiscate your rental car and give me the keys. So I gave him the keys, and he took me to a bus depot in the middle of nowhere. It was really dark. I had to figure out the bus that was going up to Vermont. And so he also reached in my wallet and took $20 for bail. I do remember that part. Which I didn't think much of it, but I just said, I've never experienced anything like this. This is very interesting. Mm. So I got on a bus and went to Vermont. It was really dark. Got to the bus terminal, which was in a parking lot near the Veterans Administration Hospital in White River Junction, Vermont. And I looked on the board to see if there was a taxi that could take me to this little town in Vermont where my mom lived. And I didn't have any cash, so I had to look for a taxi that took a credit card. Anyway, I think the last coherent thing I did before things started going way downhill was directing this taxi driver in his Jeep to Barnard, Vermont, a little town of maybe a couple thousand people. So it was quite a dark time that I just sort of said, well, like a lot of things I've done in life, you just sort of get through it and don't think about it too much.
So you were pretty much just in survival mode, one foot in front of the other. And I would imagine you were starting to, feeling more shifts internally in terms of your cognition and all that sort of thing.
Yes, I felt incredibly tired, and I couldn't figure out why, because I hadn't really had sleep deprivation or, just a general fuzzy feeling. Like my thinking processes were a little dull, but again, I couldn't figure out, there wasn't any reason, so I just sort of let it go.
Wow. So you made it to your mother's house.
Yeah. And the following day I took her to her appointments. Since I didn't have a car, we had to ask a friend to take us to the medical center, which was about an hour drive away. Got there and I continued to feel really sleepy, and got through the oncology appointment, came back to my mom's place, had dinner, and then in the evening time, I started kind of doing weird things. Like I walked into my mom's bedroom and looking for my clothes in her closet, and said that I needed to get clothes for work. And she said, you're not you're what's going on? You're not out. You don't need work clothes. And then I got some ice cream out of her freezer and I put it in the oven to warm it up because it was really solid. And then just started wandering around. So she called her best friend, who was a retired English professor at UVM, University of Vermont. And Margaret came over and started taking notes like a good English professor. And she called her husband and she said, David, John's acting this way. And he said, well, something's wrong. Call 911. So she did, and went to this little hospital, about 15 miles away from where my mom lived, and then fell essentially into a coma with intermittent periods of lucency.
So at that time, as you were starting to act pretty strange outwardly, just from the medical point of view, what was happening in your brain during that period?
What was happening is the herpes virus was invading basically my brain cells. So my ability to think, in other words, impulses weren't traveling to the right places so that I could think properly.
Wow.
And my consciousness was greatly impaired. And it is very aggressive about going after certain areas of your brain. But anyway, it created this incredible inflammation, and that's part of the problem. It's like a 5-alarm fire, or basically a 2-alarm fire and a 5-alarm fire response. So my immune system was really working overtime to try to kill off this herpes virus. But the herpes virus is very cagey and can get around the human immune response. So basically, I had, my brain was on fire, both from an infection and from my body's response to the.
Wow. So you went into a coma.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
Yep. So I went to this little hospital, and thank God they had this antiviral medicine called acyclovir that they gave intravenously. It was just a miracle they had it, because it's very expensive, and a lot of times hospitals can't afford to stock it. But I got it, and that really saved my life. And
so if you hadn't had gotten it, what would have happened at that critical time?
well, I don't know exactly how long I could survive, but it would have been probably just a couple of days and I would have been dead.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, and the other thing is it prevents your brain from being entirely annihilated by the herpes virus, because that was one big problem. I actually got treated late in the game because the herpes virus had been around for probably a couple of days. invading my brain. So yeah.
So after you received this, this intravenous treatment, did I'm assuming that either slowed down or halted the process, but from what I understand is a lot of damage was done.
Yes. A lot of damage was done, and it primarily was to my right brain, hardly anything to my left brain. And it all kind of makes sense because the herpes virus travels north. So it went from my finger up my arm into my brain. And it was all on the right side because that's where the initial infection was in my dominant right hand. Yeah, so there's severe damage to my right brain.
So so this sort of like opens up the whole piece around number one, like assessing the damage, but then number two, um, an assessment of what its effect was. And then the third, of course, like looking toward recovery. So when you got the assessment, but what was it? What was life like with the right side of your brain somewhat offline?
That's a good question because it kind of gets into the realm of what the left hemisphere does and what the right hemisphere does. So the left hemisphere is where all the bad stuff happens in our experience as humans. It's where anxiety comes from. It's where judgment comes from. It's where linear thinking comes from. It's where we get our habits of looking back at what we could have done and what we need to do in the future. It's the detail part of your brain. And the right brain is where all the good stuff comes from, basically. It's where compassion and empathy and creativity. It's where our senses of humor come from. It's where our ability to understand non-language related stuff like metaphors and poetry and music and whatnot. The left brain doesn't like that stuff. It wants basically details. It wants things broken into details. And so my right brain was in ashes. So my left brain was kind of in charge, unfortunately.
Wow. So Jill Bolte Taylor, with whom you've had conversations in the past, quite famously, told the story of one side of her brain going offline, which was the other side.
Yeah.
And with that was her experience of presence, of intuition, of this God force, if you will, and just sort of like this blissful place of being. You had the opposite experience.
I had the opposite experience entirely. And the thing is, I lived in my left brain mostly anyway.
Yeah, so say a little bit about that. I mean, you're
Well,
pretty much
yeah,
you were a left brain guy. That was
yeah.
your life strategy was pretty much based on the left brain.
Yes. First of all, culturally, we kind of look toward we like left brain thinking in our culture because that's the part of our brain that is detail oriented. That's where our list of things to do get done, and it's where language comes from. So the left brain really likes using language to describe things. It's also where anger comes from. It's where probably racism comes from, because things are, the left brain doesn't like things that aren't familiar. Whereas the right brain sees things in context, isn't very language oriented, and it faces reality. And the right brain is what has humans look at reality. The left brain is where delusions reside, and that's where schizophrenia and autism and various thought disorders come from, because it's the place of delusion. I think we have a lot of left brain politicians right now. Anyway, when you don't have a right brain to modulate that, the left brain, you end up basically being terrorized.
So you went into the sciences, as you're a farm boy who became anesthesiologist. Like you dedicated yourself to science and to cultivating that side of your brain. And I just remember one very ironic comment you made when you saw an art class in college. I wonder if you could just share that.
Yeah, I remember walking by the studio art department and saying to myself, who would ever do that? You can't make any money at it. And they're just a bunch of hippies that you can't talk to. And, it was just a really arrogant thought. I never said it to anybody except myself.
Well, what I find so ironic, and we'll get to this in a little bit, is that art has actually become a major part of your life, not only your recovery, but expressing who you are. So
yes.
John, could you say a little bit about it? Because an interesting thing about your experience is you got to experience, and by proxy, we get to sense like what it's like when the left brain is running things. What was it like for you as you're just going through the trauma of recognizing what happened, and to sort of feel the left brain running your life? What was that like?
It was, I don't know what metaphor you would use. It's sort of like being put in a jail cell and being kind of taunted all day long.
Wow.
Because to give you some examples, I'd wake up in the morning and I didn't have anything to do because I wasn't working. All of a sudden, boom, I didn't have any job. And my left brain would just keep taunting and say, you need to get up and do something. But there was nothing to do. Don't take a walk because that's a waste of time. You can be doing something, but there was never any solution really, like doing what? The right brain, which wasn't online, would say normally, well, the reality is you had a really bad brain injury. You can't work. So just kind of be a little gentler on yourself. But the left brain just wouldn't allow that.
Wow. So there was no kindness, no empathy, just sort of this hard driving critic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
Wow. Yeah, it's all, when I step back, I used to say to myself, this is one interesting neurologic experiment I'm witnessing, but it's happening to me. Especially to learn more about the function of the left and right brain. Like, I had an aha moment once, like, I was struggling with art because the right brain is where your ability to see proportions. So when you're drawing something, your hand isn't as big as your chest. Things like that. And color was hard. And, I couldn't recognize faces. Like my son was walking down the street once and I couldn't recognize his face. So art was really hard because all the essential things you need to do art were gone. And an example is there was some German artist who suffered a right brain stroke like 100 years ago. And he started drawing faces as squares because the left brain said, things aren't curved, they're straight. Thus the linear left brain.
Wow.
You
Wow.
don't need to draw things in a curve. Um, so
So what I find interesting, John, is that you could have had access to some of the best scientific minds on the planet, you know, and you were able to get a lot of the science diagnosis, and from what I understand, a lot of folks really didn't know what to do to kind of help you become integrated again. But one of them was to do art.
um, yes, but that's an interesting point because as my neurologist at Johns Hopkins said, we don't know much about the right brain. Most of the money spent from the National Institute of Health goes towards the left brain because we're right-handed. Most people are right-handed. And it's where language and memory comes from. So you can kind of check off things that are coming back online if you have a left brain injury. Your speech is getting better, your memory is getting better. Whereas the right brain, things are a lot more subtle. Like, how do you check off, well, your sense of humor is back. Okay, your ability to understand irony is back. Well, there's no test for that really.
Right.
Or you can draw a face that looks okay instead of a big square. It just isn't part of the
Yeah, we
vernacular.
have now determined you can take a hint. There's
Yeah.
there's no scale for that. So the question is, like, if someone's, those who are listening and watching now are kind of thinking, well, my gosh, seems incredibly articulate, smart, good-looking guy. It seems like everything's okay. Can you say a little bit about the journey? Because we've known each other for some years, and there was a time where truly you really couldn't escape from the relentlessness of the left brain and the anxiety and the needing to double check if you had taken your medications or if you had turned the lights off. Like, it was a very profound state of disorientation, to put it mildly.
Mhm.
Can you say a little bit about what has been the process of healing?
Um, it's interesting because initially people thought, like, I was in the brain rehabilitation program at the Washington Hospital Center in downtown Washington, D.C. And because I could talk without a problem and I had memory, people in my program would say, why are you here? What do you expect to get out of this? And so it was very hard because, people would say, oh, you're back to normal. You can talk. You seem to be walking okay. And you remember things. But that's the problem with trying to rehabilitate a right brain, is that it's very hard to assess those places that are not necessarily very compartmentalized, I guess is the way I would put it. And it's interesting too, because trying to do things like art, all the things I needed as tools in my brain to do art were gone, because art comes from your right brain, really. That's where, like I said, your ability to see things in proportion and see things in perspective, like railroad tracks going into the distance, they kind of come to a point. Whereas, in the right brain, you can figure that out. In the left brain, they just want the railroad tracks just keep on going. And then colors, trying to get colors right. Well, I'd say, why did you use blue when it's green? Well, oh, really? So it's very discouraging.
I think you
And
shared once how you were working really hard on a piece, to make it accurate, and someone commented on what a beautiful abstract piece of part you you had just created.
I just I was like an arrow. Yeah. Um, so it was um, very discouraging at times. So I've been asked, well, why did you keep going? Given all these difficulties. And the discouraging thing is I couldn't get any answers from anybody. Um, even people that write a lot about left and right brain function, there's no way, or there was no prescription about how to rehabilitate your right brain.
So you had no other recourse than to perform experiments and see how
Yeah.
they how they turned out for you.
Yeah, and that's exactly true.
So for those who are listening, I think there can be this sense of, just as you were saying, that while you were presenting as someone, cogent and articulate, people are thinking, well, what's wrong? And at the same time, here's this kind of unrelenting, critic. Here you are, kind of like cut off from the flow. And I think for many of us, we can feel like, well, from the outside, everything's fine, but internally there's that ruthless critic and so forth. So part of our relationship has been around meditation and some of the somatic inquiry and so forth. And I wonder if you might say a little bit about the role that has had.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about meditation, but anyway, for me, doing conventional meditation, like sitting and focusing on my breath and just sitting and sitting, for me, it was a recipe for my left brain to go crazy, because all of a sudden there was space for it to invade. Now, so meditation a lot of days was just the recipe to go crazy. What I think really changed for me was doing focusing. To use Jonathan Faust's term, body-centered inquiry. Doing that basically quieted my left brain enough so my right brain had a chance, and all these visual images came out that were really interesting and appealing. And it's also, virtually everything I'm saying, I'm parroting from other places, so I have no original thoughts.
No one does.
But they've looked at Tibetan monks and Franciscan nuns using a functional scan called a SPECT scan, and they asked the Tibetan monks to meditate to the point of a deep place, and the same with the Franciscan nuns, where they were asked to pray to a deep place. Anyway, their left brains became quiet. So if you want, we all live in our left brains too much, probably, in the world. So I think it would be really practical if people got to a place or a way of meditating where their left brain became quiet for a while. I think that would be mentally healthy. And for me, it was like, wow, this is I'm thinking so differently now after that experience.
To maybe just to kind of reiterate a little bit, for those who are listening, that body-centered inquiry is really around training your attention on what we call the felt sense, the feeling tone in the body. And when I think about most of the sessions that we do, I certainly remember like the first one we did, when you were sensing where there was tension inside, you became aware of like of a tension behind your eyes, kind of a pulling behind the eyes. And part of the entryway was you sort of described what it felt like in such detail that I could recreate the same sensations
Mhm.
and explored how to be with it. And then something shifted, the tension began to open, and then that seemed to open a portal to what we call flow, just the stream and cascade of images and really amazing experiences with kind of visual displays and kaleidoscope images and so
Yeah.
forth that seem to um, create a really interesting space inside.
Yes. You know, initially I thought to myself, well, is this going to be freaky? And then there's this kind of all this rationalization going on, no, it's not going to be freaky, you're with Jonathan, he's not going to do something weird or anything like that. And you don't have any alternative. You do not have any alternative. You got to try this. So that kind of I mean, it was like I don't know, going down a path where this was the only way, for now at least. And there, I just sort of sat back and said to myself, "Well, let's see what happens." And what happened was really, really therapeutic.
It's interesting because when we think of the left brain is always, it's always commenting, it always has that negative bias. And because you were focusing on, you discovered unpleasant sensations kind of behind the eyes, somehow there's kind of an override. Like let's going to take our attention and we're going to stay with the unpleasant. It almost seems like it was the willingness to turn toward the unpleasant that opened this doorway to kind of another realm where suddenly you've shifted from kind of that judging, controlling space inside to almost this sense of like free association and ease.
Yes. When I sit back and look at it, I know there's a part of your left brain that can actually be rational as opposed to irrational. And I think there was a point where there was no alternative. And it's I think it's kind of like having a pilot light on in your hot water heater. It's this little dim light that will allow you to reignite your hot water heater. I think, when you're in a situation of not having a lot of hope, that this particular thing of doing focusing really kind of brought out the pilot light and ignited something in the water heater.
Wow, that's a
To
great
use a
analogy.
really kind of out there metaphor. But
Well, but I wonder too, John, and I find it so interesting because like your experience was so extreme, and yet we all experienced that left brain split, with one side dominating. But I'm also wondering how much that pilot light is this sense of the witness, that just like, there's the difference between being angry and being with your anger, that when the left brain was so dominant, there was something about the meditative experience that actually allowed you to be aware of that function that opened up some new possibilities, perhaps. Does that resonate?
it does. It does. I think when you're in survival mode, I think you have to have realistic optimism. Like there has to be some hope. But it may not be easy. That's the realism.
Well, as a doctor for other people, I would imagine that you held that stance for others. Like, yes, this is a, yes, this is a problem, and the decision tree opens up, three things we might explore that might open up new possibilities. And you're able to do that for yourself, it seems.
Yeah. Well, yes. Self-compassion is in a really in the left brain where we psychologically live, at least most of us do, I think. There's not a lot of self-compassion. You're like, oh, you want a new car? Well, this is what you got to do, how much overtime you got to do. Well, if you want to pass this exam, this is the stuff you got to do. You don't, and the left brain is always in a hurry. Carrie Newcomer, who's a kind of a spiritual Americana folk singer, has this song called "Learn to Sit Without Knowing." The left brain cannot sit without knowing.
Wow.
And how many people in the, growing up or where we live have this problem with not knowing? I had to, that's one thing I learned, is that, I don't know. I think that's a thing that people don't say enough of, is I don't know.
Wow.
I still have the herpes virus in my cranial nerve, and it'll live there forever. There's supposedly a 1 in 1,000 chance it'll come back, and it did once a couple of years ago. But that's sort of something I've accepted, that I don't know, and I think that's a very freeing thing, to not know. Can you accept that?
Well, that's one of the elements that it so inspires me about your journey, John, is, moving from the, being in a jail cell, with the ruthless critic, and your perseverance, to stay open, to keep trying new things, to it has taken you into a profound journey of wholeness and insight. And boy, to learn to sit without knowing, that's what all the great traditions point to. Like that is sort of the top of the mountain in many ways.
Well, it's, like I said, it's very freeing. We spend so much mental energy, like, I need to know. I need to know the outcome of something, and a lot of times there's no answer.
So if you go back in time to, being on your way somewhere and seeing that art class and having those thoughts, and when you take that moment and you sort of like bring it into here and now and where you are in your life right now, quite a journey.
It is quite a journey. I will admit that. It's quite a story. Like in the podcast I did with Bolte Taylor, I said, it wasn't recorded. I said, talking about this, I think, is something that'd be useful for the world as a whole, because so many of us live psychologically in our left brain. And, when our minds are racing, it's all left brain. And if you get into the right brain, modulate the left brain, you get much more balance. And I think it's mentally, in terms of mental health, it's just so much better. And that's the key thing, I think, if I wanted to tell the world something, there's some simple things you can do that will make you mentally healthier.
And maybe just in these final minutes, that's a beautiful message. When you say the simple things that help you feel better, can you just say a little bit about what they are for you?
I think taking walks in nature. And what I'm saying is kind of I'm not saying anything that this is a John Britton totally new way of surviving the pandemic or anything else in life, because everybody's got an angle. But this is just my experience. I'm not prescribing it for anybody, but I think listening to music, there's an Australian rock singer named Nick Cave who talks about how music is where your soul's at. Because it's where you're not using words, although he writes songs with lyrics. It's a place of kind of solitude that music gets you to. I think art, even doodling on a scrap of paper or just appreciating art, it's just really, again, this is what has been useful for me. And I think meditating in a way that where your left brain isn't hijacking you. And that may take take a while. And it's everybody's got their own way of dealing with that. But and I also think being around people, Parker Palmer talks about when he was in the throes of a deep depression, that community and solitude, you need both to try to handle some badness, some darkness.
Wow, thank you for that. It's one thing to be prescriptive. Part of me wants to say, "Oh, here's Dr. Britton's prescription for whole health living," but I just want to kind of reflect back, and I really get that it comes from your experience that being in nature, is just a profound way of accessing that part of your brain and listening to music, like taking time to really listen and kind of receive music in the moment, exploring art, being around like-minded people, looking for the practices that sort of help to kind of subdue, the left brain, which I imagine are like really being aware of sensation, perhaps even kind of the metta or the kindness practices are all some of the techniques that can help you to find that place of balance.
Yeah, no, that for sure. Absolutely.
Wow. Well, John, thank you so much for your time. What an amazing journey. And I'm so glad you're writing about this because there's so much we all need to learn about finding balance in these weird times we live in.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Thank you.